Hello BookTube, this is part 43 of my 2022 library tour, Science Fiction and Fantasy 19. I'm continuing on with my brother's bookcase, which is a big monstrosity that my brother built for me about 3 years ago, which, while not the most well put together bookcase, I do have a sentimental attachment to it, even if I would like him to improve it some. But anyway, let's get on with the books on this particular shelf. It's the middle shelf. Again, the bookcase is big, so the shelves are large, particularly the three lower shelves. So let's get going. And this one is going to be a pretty rough shelf too, because, yeah. Anyway, the first book is Docile by K.M. Zapara. This is a dystopic near-future science fiction novel in which debt slavery is a thing again, and it's brought about by a drug called Docile, which not only makes the users amenable to suggestions, to orders, but it also scrambles their memories of the time on the drug so that they don't remember exactly what their owners made them do. So the story itself is about a young man whose family is crushed by debt, and the only way to get out from under it is to sell himself. However, he refuses to take the docile drug, Docilene, because his mother had an incredibly bad experience with it that wrecked her life, that completely destroyed her mind. For which one thinks, well, why exactly did they not sue the manufacturer? Because, yeah, or anything but whatever. So he sells himself. He refuses to take Docilene, the drug, and he is bought by the son of the company that produces the Docilene drug. When he learns that his new slave refuses to take the drug, he decides to train him in such a way that he basically is a docile without having to take the drug or something like that. When I had a lot, there are a lot of red flags with this book. I do not like dystopic science fiction. I do not like slave fics. Particularly slave fics in which the world building is tortured into making the BDSM a vital part of the world building. I mean, if you want to have a BDSM relationship, you have a BDSM relationship. You don't need the world building to be tortured into making everybody have BDSM relationships or something. Anyway. But I wanted to read this because it's a work of LGBTQ science fiction, and I do have a interest in LGBTQ science fiction and fantasy. Unfortunately, when I had a go at this book last year, I really did not like it. I bailed within maybe a chapter or 3. It was bad. So, anyway. But before I bailed on Docile, I did buy K.M. Zapara's second book, First Become Ashes, which is more of a fantasy. If you squint, it may not actually be a fantasy novel about a cult that believed it basically was living in a fantasy novel, and the way for the children of this cult to gain magical powers is for them to be tortured in sexual ways, And one of the survivors of this cult fervently believes he does have magical powers, that he's a chosen hero, and he goes on a quest to do his thing. He's being followed by another former member of the cult who turned them in, and then the hero falls in with a cosplayer or a fantasy fan who sort of takes advantage of our hero's belief that he's in a fantasy novel or something. It might be fantasy, it might not be. I don't know. I haven't gotten around to this yet. I don't know if I really want to, given that I had such a immediate reaction to Docile. So anyway, that was First to Come Ashes. So the next 5 books are by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is his Shadows of the Apps series, starting with Empire in Black and Gold. The Shadows of the Apps series is a big, massive fantasy epic that deals with a world in which various cultures of humanity are inspired by insects, and these human groups have various attributes that one typically gives to insects. So the wasp people are warlike, the moth people are wizards, the ant people are industrious, the bee people I think are industrious too, the spiders are basically intriguers, that sort of thing. Some of these cultures or peoples have natural magical talents. The moths, the mantises, I think, and some don't, like the beetles. And those without magical powers have technical talents. They can produce machinery and technology which the magicals can't use. Anyway, so basically the series starts off with the Empire of Wasps launching a massive invasion of their nearest neighbors, and of a beetle scientist who tries to fight against them. I read this in 2019, I think, and I've had this for a few years. I picked this up in 2016 when Hastings was closing down because I'd wanted to read the Shadow of the App series for a while. So I finally got around to it in 2019 and didn't particularly care for it. Although before then, I did pick up 4 more books in this series: Dragonfly Falling, Blood of the Mantis, Salute the Dark, and The Scarab Path. The next 2 books are the first 2 books in the Wrath and Athenaeum series by Naman Gobert Tillahan. The first book is The Root. This is for all intents and purposes, a YA fantasy novel about a young former teen actor named Eric who discovers he is part of a secret legacy of demigods. So he falls in with a society that is dedicated to protecting these demigods against an encroaching world in which monsters exist and stuff. And there's and it's kind of a congruent plot, or kind of like a second plot set in this other world about a young librarian who kind of has adventures. I I don't really like this novel all that much. I read it shortly after it came out and kind of petered out on it. And then I made another concerted effort to read it about a year later, and I didn't like it. I think too many characters have point of view chapters when it really should just be Eric, and I think the main character on the other side is Lil. I think they really should be the only two point of view characters, and their chapters should sort of back and forth. But I mean, even the most minor character has a point of view chapter, and that it's too cluttered ultimately. And I had a few other issues with the book, but I did pick up the sequel, The Tree. At some point, I think this year, the final book in the trilogy, The Fruit, should be released. Although the book has a rather tortured publishing history. Let me see, who is it? Yeah. Could be because it's Nightshade Books. They've had some issues in the past, so could still be having those issues. The next two books are by J.R.R. Tolkien. First up is The Hobbit. This is, obviously needs no introduction or anything. I picked it up from the Friends of the Library Book Sale Nook a few years ago, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. And I, of course, have The Lord of the Rings in this movie tie-in combined edition, which again needs no introduction because it's arguably the greatest work of fantasy ever and the cornerstone of fantasy as a genre. So. Next is an anthology, The Very Best of Science Fiction, edited by Gordon Van Gelder. This is the 60th anniversary and has a number of really good stories in it. I remember quite liking this anthology, and I had it a few years ago and let it go, and then picked it back up a few years ago. So, yeah. The next three books are by Catherine M. Valenti. First is Radiance. This is a space opera set in a very different solar system than the one we know. A solar system in which every planet is habitable, even Pluto. And the solar system is much smaller. The planets are much closer together to where even with early 20th century technology, one can get to Neptune and Pluto easily. It's a story of a aged director, Percival Onk, who is trying to come to terms with the death of his daughter, Severin, who herself was a filmmaker, although a documentary filmmaker, who disappeared and is presumed dead after filming at a mysterious colony destruction that seems to be plaguing the setting. And Percival Ung kind of comes to terms with his daughter's death in the only way he can, which is by trying to make it into a movie, which goes off the rails. And then there are a few other sort of texts interspersed. For a while, I first read this in 2017, and it was my favorite book of 2017. And I kind of reread it in 2019 and still really liked it. But I read it again last year, and I'm much more critical of it now. So, anyway. Next is the book that came out immediately after Radiance, The Refrigerator Monologues by, again, Catherine M. Valenti. This is her riff on both the vagina monologues as well as Women in Refrigerators, the comic book trope in which mostly female characters, although not always, are brutally murdered to give um, motivation to um, mostly male, although not always, hero. And the women are typically romantic partners, although it doesn't necessarily have to be romantic partners. The term refrigerator or women in refrigerators is from an issue of Green Lantern, in which the Green Lantern at the time, Kyle Rayner, was thinking about stopping being Green Lantern. And his girlfriend, I know her name I think was DeWitt, Catherine DeWitt, I think, was brutally murdered by the supervillain Major Force and stuffed into a fridge. Hence, women in refrigerators. And of course, her brutal death, drove Kyle Rayner to, redouble his efforts as Green Lantern, and to have a personal grudge against Major Force. So that's sort of the origin of this book. And the Refrigerator Monologues itself is a series of short stories, or links to short stories about a group of women who, in this superhero setting, were tied to male superheroes in various ways, mostly romantic, who died and have gone to the underworld. And so they kind of form a little support group. And the conceit is that they each tell their own story. I've tried to get into this book numerous times, and I failed every time. It's, in a way, I think, doesn't have the impact of the actual comics themselves. Because those characters just, yeah. So I've never gotten on with this book, despite numerous attempts to. So, I think maybe had it been either a single novel that kind of looked at this more in depth, or something, I don't know. But as it is, it really doesn't work, I don't think. And I also have Space Opera, which was the novel that came out the following year from Refrigerator Monologues. This is obviously a space opera. It's about basically Eurovision in space. One day in the kind of sort of nearish future, aliens come to Earth and say, basically, we have to, or humanity has to, participate in an interstellar version of Eurovision, and if we don't win, or if we don't place above last place, Earth will be destroyed. And the musical group selected by these aliens to save the Earth, to represent Earth, is a long, washed out, disbanded punk rock band that kind of sort of maybe was from that era, maybe was later. It's all kind of weird. So I bailed on this book twice. And when I finally got around to it, I think I gave it a Bell Redemption in 2020, and I did finally finish it. It was one of the two books that were Bell Redemption achieved. But I still didn't like it. It's too much of a mess, I think. And it just doesn't work. The next three books are Sword and Sorcery novels. They're the War of Power series by Robert E. Vardaman and Victor Milan. The first book is The Sundered Realm, which I read and was crap. But before I got around to reading it, I did pick up two of the sequels. the Destiny Stone, and the City in the Glacier. I picked them all up from Golden's, and I think either all together or over the course of a few weeks. The next 4 books are anthologies by Jeff and Ann Vandermeer. First is sort of the twin anthologies of The New Weird and Steampunk, which came out I think within the same year or a year or two. So first up is The New Weird. The New Weird is a genre of speculative fiction that draws on the earliest forms of science fiction, which is largely weird, but adds in sort of postmodern themes, a more literary ambition, a bit more focus on body horror, that sort of thing, and had its heyday in the kind of late 90s and early 2000s. I mean, the most famous examples of New Weird would be China Miéville's Bossalog novels. So I had wanted this anthology for a while. I quite enjoyed it. There's a number of really good stories in here. You see here, I think, yeah, The Luck in the Head by M. John Harrison's really good. The Branding of Mother Lamprey by Simon D. Ings is quite good. Jack by China Miéville is really good. The City of Ooze by Jay Lakes, amazing. The Art of Dying by K.J. Bishop, I think I quite liked. The Gutter Sees the Light That Never Shines by Alistair Rennie is amazing, and I have no idea why. As far as I know, he's only had 2 published short stories, because you would have think there would have been a lot more. But the problem I have with this anthology is that the later half of the book or the last 100 or so pages, is more of a critical sort of look at New Weird and a sort of a round robin short story thing, which I didn't particularly care for. So it's a mixed bag. Steampunk is a pretty good anthology too. I think probably a bit better than The New Weird. And Steampunk is basically Victorian, a Victorian setting with greater technological advancement using the materials at the time. Although I think this one too has although I don't particularly care, I didn't care for as many of the stories in this one, I think, because I really like The God Clown is Near by Jay Lake. I think might actually have been the one that I really liked. So maybe I'm not quite accurate in saying I like this one better. Or at least this one is more fully short stories, whereas The New Weird isn't. And that's kind of where I knocked The New Weird. Next, of course, is The Big Book of Science Fiction. This is a massive anthology that covers science fiction from proto-science fiction to near contemporary to when this was published. I read it over the course of last November for New Worlds in November, and if you'd been following my weekly reads during that time period, you will know that for the most part I struggled with this book. I mean, it's a massive achievement, but most of the stories really didn't do it for me, which was depressing. And I also have The Big Book of Classic Fantasy. This is an anthology much like The Big Book of Science Fiction, although instead of all of fantasy being in one anthology, it is split up into 2. The Classic Fantasy and then modern fantasy. I really haven't dipped into this book yet. If I had participated in February Fantasy Stories in a more concise, intentional way, I might have gotten to this, or I might not have. So, anyway. And I also have by Jeff Vandermeer himself, Ambergris. This is a omnibus edition of Jeff Vandermeer's Ambergris novels, City of Saints and Madmen, Shriek and Afterward, and Finch. And I picked this up largely because I wanted to read these novels for a while, and I was curious to see how Jeff Vandermeer was as a writer. I've read his book on writing, the Wonder Book, and I wanted to see how he handled writing fiction himself. The next book is Mazes of Power by Juliet Wade. I picked this up largely because, much like with Jeff Vandermeer, Juliet Wade does a lot of work on writing. She had a blog called Talk to Your Universe, where she touched on various world-building topics, and she also had a YouTube channel, although she hasn't uploaded in a number of months, if not more than a year, where she would do live streams, where she would talk to a regular panel of writers and critics, and they would talk about various world-building subjects. Anyway, so Mazes of Power is the first book in a trilogy set in her setting in which the people live underground, and they live in an incredibly stratified society, even though the main character doesn't really sort of match the type of character that would have existed in that setting, given his position and all that. Although his brother's more closer to it, and I guess he's eventually the antagonist, I didn't like this book at all, unfortunately. Next is Legacy of Ash by Matthew Ward. This is the first book in a massive epic fantasy trilogy that I think has recently been concluded. It's about a young man who is the hereditary prince of a conquered kingdom, who must decide whether he will side with his conquerors or with a neighboring country who plans to sort of stop this imperial republic. I'm not entirely sure why I picked this up, because the description, my first sort of dipping into the novel, kind of raised my hackles, but I did it anyway. So I do want to have a look at it and ultimately see before I decide to send it on its way. Anyway, next is another book I have absolutely no idea why I bought, and that is the Night Angel Trilogy. This is the complete trilogy. It's by Brent Weeks. It's a YA epic fantasy series that I read the first book in the series years ago, and I hated it. But for some reason, I saw it at Golden's Book Exchange years ago and decided to pick it up. The next three books are more books by Brent Weeks, and his Lightspringer series, his most recent series. Although I don't know if he's written anything since it's been a few years since he finished it, so I don't know. But anyway, so the first book is The Black Prism, which I think I picked up from Hastings shortly before they closed, although, no, I think I might have picked this up from Golden's. And then I picked up the sequel, The Blinding Knife, from Hastings before they closed in 2016. And of course I haven't gotten to these yet. and also have the third book, The Broken Eye. Next is Ship of Smoke and Steel by Django Rexler. I think this is the first book in a YA fantasy series. It's about a young woman who gets on a boat and does something. I don't quite remember a lot about it, but I thought it sounded interesting at the time. The next two books are by Martha Wells. First up is The Element of Fire, which I think I picked up from Golden's Book Exchange. Possibly during my last trip there, maybe before. And I also have City of Bones. And The Death of the Necromancer, which I'm pretty sure was picked up the last time I went to Golden's. So, BookTube, that concludes part 43 of my 2022 library tour. Only one more video remains, and I'll be done. This has been exhausting, BookTube. So I will see you tomorrow for the grand finale of my 2022 library tour, and of course, weekly reads. Until then, BookTube, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.